Those less equal: women's rights, Native people's rights. Women's suffrage and social reform. At the turn of the century, women, Native Canadians, immigrants of Asian descent, and other newcomers to Canada, they did not have many rights. None of the above had the right to vote, and there was very little equality. Before the invention of such things as the washing machine, housework, child rearing consumed much of the average woman's day. So basically, the women were responsible for taking care of the family, running the house, chores, things like that, and they had to do a lot of it by hand. The educational exceptions were low because most women did not work outside the home after marriage. In 1900, only 15% of the undergraduates at university were women. Women were banned from professions like law, and they were not eligible for scholarships. You have to understand they were still living in a male egocentric world during this time period, and many women were getting tired of this. Women's suffrage comes to the forefront during the Laurier era. You have to understand what suffrage is. Suffrage is the idea behind people suffering for rights, suffering for recognition, things like that. These women were devoted to social reform and trying to get the right to vote, because if they don't have the right to vote, they cannot have any say in government and what happens to them. They blamed the problems of society on the growing problems of alcoholism. Problems like child neglect and poverty were some of the things they looked at. In 1885, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was created, and they promoted prohibition. So you have to understand, many of the women felt that alcohol was the biggest problem in the downfall of the society during that time period, and they were out to try and ban alcohol, but they could not ban alcohol at the time because they had no rights in the government. So you can see where they're struggling to get into government so they can bring in some of these reforms that they thought were ruining society. This is Taz. Suffragists were also known as maternal feminists because they believed that the skills of wives and mothers would bring fresh, compassionate perspective to a male-dominated government. So they basically felt that, hey, you know what, we almost need the motherly figure in government in order for things to become better. They believed that female influence could change laws to improve the lives of women and children. The suffragist movement was a worldwide movement. It wasn't just in Canada, it was worldwide during this time period. But Canadian women generally were a bit more peaceful. Many places around the world, women actually rioted and got into physical conflicts with many of the people in charge. The campaign was led by the Women's Suffrage Association, which was supported by the National Council of Women of Canada, founded by Lady Aberdeen. She was the wife of the Governor General and had a great influence because of her husband. It's kind of interesting that one of the ladies who was involved in the suffragist movement just happens to be also the Governor General's wife, so she has a lot of political standing. Early successes for the suffrage movement come on the prairies. Some believed it was a result of hardships that women went through in the West, being right beside men who were settling, beginning homestead. Without women helping the men settle in the homesteads, none of this would happen. So the women not only had to keep the house, raise the children, but they also had to help out on the farm and do many of the chores around the farm. But they were not being treated as equal when it came to society in general, so a lot of women wanted to change this. Prairie men were more inclined to give the vote because they seen what women had gone through and considered them more as equals as a result. It was a way for the farmers of the West to increase the farm vote and to influence provincial governments. You have to understand, these women worked hard, they did things. A lot of the women who lived in the cities and were part of the political elite, they did not do much, and they didn't care because they had their little privileged lives. But many of these women who worked in the prairies and lived in the prairies had to struggle to survive, so therefore the men saw them struggling to survive along with them and felt that they were as equal. But you have to understand, the rich elite did not see that. The West was the first to grant women's suffrage. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta were the first to grant the vote to women in 1916. If you look in your textbook, page 277, you'll be able to see the text. In BC, the fight for suffrages would last more than 45 years. In 1871, American suffragist Susan B. Anthony visited Victoria and spoke for women's right. Following year, a bill was proposed and turned down. 1873, women that had property had the right to vote in municipal elections. That means local elections. In 1899, another suffragist bill was shot down, but this time by a vote of 15 to 17, so it was a lot closer. 1912, suffrage was part of the Liberal campaign in BC. That's how they ran their political thing. They promised women, if we got voted in, we will give you the right to vote. 1916, a referendum was passed on the issue. In 1917, granted women the right to vote and hold political office. It was believed that politics was a man's work, and it was It was beliefs like this that hindered the women's suffragist movement. Nellie McClung, as you guys probably all seen in those silly video thing. She's the one that holds the big whip and hits the desk with it, as is normal. But she was known, probably the most well-known suffragist. She campaigned for women's rights. She was instrumental in the persons case, in which saw Canadian women declared persons in 1929. Look at the date there. 1929 is when women were officially recognized as people in Canada. Up to this point, they were not even recognized as people. She put on a play called The Women's Parliament, satire which turned the tables and poked fun at the dangers of giving men the right to vote. This is instrumental in getting women the right to vote in Manitoba first. Canada had the group known as the Famous Five: Nellie McClung, Emily Murphy, Henrietta Edwards, Louise McKinley, and Irene Parlby. These Famous Five were the women who were basically the faces of the suffragist movement in Canada. End of part 1.